Let's see. So I'm a little flying blind here, so please let me know if you cannot hear me. I'm assuming that everything's coming. Okay, let me just export my slides,
Everything's good?
and then we'll be good to go. Okay. And sorry, just lost it here. Go ahead and okay. You see my notes and so on. Here we go. So good. So again, stop me if anything's not coming through. So my objective tonight, it's tonight in Chicago, so it's you're a little bit ahead in time, as you know, is to just give you some general ideas about the state of urban science, what it is, and how it can be used. And as Yamin said, I'm not a stranger to Singapore in some sense. I've visited many times. I've never lived. But I have a sense of a very rich ecosystem that's increasingly conscious of new ideas, new possibilities, new objectives. And so that's really what we're talking about. So in that spirit, my talk will be a little bit provocative. So I just want to take us a little bit out of the sphere maybe of policy and just what science may have to offer, and then we'll come back again. So that's more or less, I think, good fodder for just fine research programs and further debate. So I just wanted to say also, I just stepped down as director of the Matsuda Institute, so I'm a professor in all these places at the University of Chicago and Sept Institute. Okay, so I want to start with this, not to pick on URA, but just to say, this is essentially when I first came to Singapore to know more about its urban policy and innovation programs and things being funded by national agencies. This is more or less what is the reality of the central idea of urban planning. And it's not just in Singapore. I'm using this for Singapore because I'm talking to you. But in some ways, this is what urban planners have done, certainly in the last generation. So it's a very detailed map, basically, of land uses with a big emphasis on zoning. Therefore, what's possible and what's not possible in different parts of the space of cities, right? And so this is kind of one of the main tools traditionally for planning. And it's still, I believe in Singapore, like in many other countries and cities, it is mandated that there is such a plan, that such a plan exists. It's a legal document and therefore opens up possibilities, but also forecloses many. And what you see when you look at maps like this, traditionally, this is the plan from 2014, is a couple of things that I want to just pay attention to. The first one is that this is kind of a map that's, at first impression, very segregated, right? You have these dark pink zones, which tend to be industrial, and you have this kind of beige, orangey color, which is residential, and those occupy the majority of space. And then we have some sprinkles of other things that actually tend to be the connective tissue, a lot of education, retail, services, and so on. They are spread out in ways that are actually quite uneven. And you always see that the downtowns and the nicer places of town are at least more desirable, have more of such things. So it's kind of interesting because those there in those places arose more organically. So, okay, so why is this planning? Why do we start here? Why is this actually what matters legally and politically? It's kind of interesting, right, to ask that question. And so just to continue to pick on URA, forgive me, the plan of 2019, which I believe I just got this from the web, so forgive me, I don't know a lot about it. I'm just using it as an example. It has this kind of tension, right? So on the one hand, as you and CLC and all the universities engaged with urban research and urban science would like to emphasize, we want objectives that are really objectives for Singapore and any other city being livable, being economically very active and productive, being a nice place to live, being a place that's going to be sustainable in the future, and many other things that are really social, economic, civic, perhaps a little bit institutional, political in the sense of the way the city works. And on the other hand, on the other side, you really have that when, besides this nice landing page, we actually see that you should really look at the written statement 2019, as it says on top. And what it says is all about zoning and the law behind zoning. It's all. And a few things that need to be preserved because they're monument. There's very little else, and that's really the part that, in some sense, is approved politically. And what I want to emphasize is that there's a humongous gap, tremendous, awful, between these two things. What would make you ever think, step back and think that you will achieve the things on the left for humans by organizing space in this way, right? And so the history of zoning has often been that you want to segregate, industrial activity and so on from residential because it's polluting, but it's not for a positive reason. And what we're asking here is, how do cities work? What are the positive changes that planners can make that actually will make all these things on the left work better and in an open-ended way that keeps improving? So in some sense, this is kind of the present big question in urban planning, in any urban practice. And the question is, how does urban science, therefore, study of cities in general and how they work, what does it have to say about this? And what kind of tools does it bring to the table that perhaps suggest that we should see zoning, or more to the point, the spatial organization of cities, more as the result of good or bad social processes playing out with some need for organization at a larger scale, rather than as the beginning point, the legal document, the thing that matters. Okay, so that's more or less, if you remember nothing else, I want you to leave you with that question. Think about that and think, how do you get from A to B in some sense? How to bridge this gap? Now, with CLC, we go back a long way, and so I feel like I've given this talk with variation to many of you, many audiences of variation, so forgive me. But, in previous incarnations of this talk, we definitely fill this gap a little bit with some of the methods that have arisen in urban science the last couple of decades. So here are some years ago, these are some of the 4 main objectives that for Singapore, I believe this was through national development and so on. These are not very different from what I showed before. But the idea was to start connecting them to these structures on the left, which are a little bit more fleshed out. So urban structure, you still see a lot of this is spatial, but it need not be, right? It can also be social and have other elements of structure, or economic, right? The network of economic relations in the city, which is partly spatial, but not purely spatial. Networks and flows, which can describe some of those structures, again, in space, but not always just in space. And then in some sense, perhaps almost the most important thing, which is what agents do in these spaces. To what extent do they actually, what decisions they make? Do they make decisions for their lifetimes in hoping for a better life for them and their kids? Do they make their decisions in terms of economic markets for the short term? What's going on? So when you start bringing these things together, you start fleshing out the mechanisms, the processes that play out in cities. And that because of the special environments of cities are actually superpowered in ways that are interesting. So in some sense, what does the science of cities tell us? So over the last 20 years or so, people have been interested in cities since the beginning of anyone writing about anything. You can go in the West, classical Greek writers like Aristotle and Plato, part of that debate was about that. But in some sense, when we think about complex systems, it was already said, we think about a system made out of diverse agents who are different from each other, they know different things, they have different histories, they're interacting with each other strategically with some objective. And there are mechanisms that emerge from these bottom-up interactions, but also top-down regulation with these interactions that provide infrastructure and so on, and that make these interactions possible. And so when we go specifically to cities, you can imagine what this is in terms of cities. It's not hard to imagine, right? We live it every day. But the idea is that when you think about science, you really are thinking about how things work rather than the way things are. So it's less about the structure of space, and it is perhaps how it came to be what it is and how it might change, just to give you that example. But from this perspective, what we've learned is that the processes of cities are really fundamentally processes of interactions between agents, between people, but also between organizations, firms, governments and people and governments, and all these other people and institutions that are formed. And these can be described to some extent as social networks, so this is a tool, but these networks are actually not very rigid. They're always changing, and think about it when you go and buy a cup of coffee or do something in your life. It's not necessary it's always the same people. It's necessary that the function is there. So things like that, some of them are more personal, some of them are less. But the fact that you can interact with a lot of people, with a lot of institutions, there's a lot of knowledge and capabilities around you, basically changes the way people are, changes the way what a company can do, and results in higher economic activity, greater productivity, more culture, more ideas being created, but also changing, being embedded in social structures as well as institutions, innovation, so they're changing those structures, but also things like conflict and pollution, right? So there are things that just also the result of all this happening. And in some sense, cities are special because they amplify all these things that already exist in any society or organization, make it big, and make it really sort of dynamic, because not everyone knows everything that's going on. So what happens then is that different things happen at different scales. There's an articulation of scales where what happens in the neighborhood or in the home is different from what can happen in the urban market or in the interaction of the city as a political space. And it's really the buildup of these scales and the articulation that allows the city to work well. So I'll say more about that in a second. And it's from that perspective that we can start seeing that planning and institutions, think about political institutions, government, but sometimes also civic institutions, really allow this whole thing to work and to keep on working better, hopefully, over time, because they allow people to have services, to have homes, to have ways of transportation, to have clean air and health, such that they can be creative, social, and economic, and creative agents in other ways. And that's really how a city works. It's by constantly allowing people to have better ways to be supported and harnessing the fruits of their social interaction that a city actually does what's special about cities, but also what is latent already there in social systems. So a lot of this is actually the stuff that planners do, but it's been traditionally understood as prescriptive, that by doing this stuff, by doing zoning perfectly, whatever that might mean, you would create a fantastic city. Whereas what I'm arguing here and what we've learned is a little bit backwards, is that by creating a wonderful platform where all this becomes possible but open-ended and to a large extent under the initiative of agents, you can create a system that works very well and it's open-ended and creative. And some of those advantages need to come back to supportive structures. Okay, so in cities, what we know is that these scales are associated with different phenomena. And so urban science, a bit like physics or biology, has phenomena at different scales. There are different phenomena. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but when you think about urban systems, we often think about cities interacting with each other. In large countries like the US, they specialize. You don't have this quite in Singapore, but it means that, for example, a lot of your basic materials and agricultural products come from elsewhere, often from smaller cities. Whereas the larger city tends to specialize in management, in information, in education, things that tend to be more informational and that really benefit from these networks. It's at that scale of the city that both the economic activity, the innovation, and so forth really works well. And this is the stuff we describe in scaling laws and so on, where we see really the effect, the added effect of these infrastructures. But it's at the smaller scales of neighborhoods and households that people need those supportive structures. So this is very important because it's at those scales, which are often abstracted in zoning and planning with a bird's eye view, that quality of life, that the ability of agents to feel healthy, to do well, to feel creative, to feel encouragement to plan their lives, with optimism and so on, really happen. So it's the articulation of these things which goes back and forth that makes the city work well. It's not one scale fits all. It's really, really unpacking sort of the onion. Okay, so there are many things we've learned about urban science, taking these approaches and perspectives and studying data and phenomena at different scales. I'm going to just say a few. The first one that's most important is that even though cities have lots of things that are difficult, like congestion and pollution and conflict sometimes, they really do things. Those things exist also in smaller societies, and often they're worse per capita, but in terms of absolute numbers, they tend to be worse in cities. What you often find is that the good parts, the rich economies, the innovative societies, the advanced institutions that have more capacity, whether for planning or resilience, really are urban because they require the integration and coordination with a lot of knowledge and a lot of labor. You know this in Singapore because you know how it works. But it really takes a lot of things working together to make what you do that's most sophisticated to work. And that is very hard to do, on Zoom. And before we had Zoom, there was no other way. So cities really need to exist as these interconnected networks of different people and organizations, and these are really the base of network effects, agglomeration effects, complementarities, the advantage of cities. But this also means that cities are fundamentally cooperative places where people need to find advantage in dealing with different people. And this is actually very hard to do. So this is kind of this point about non-zero-sum games. It requires institutions that allow cities to be predictable, for people to know that they benefit from interaction with others. Sometimes it's a little bit abstract, but it has to have a sense of confidence in the future and confidence in other people around us in order to actually, for people to engage and be creative. So this is kind of a balancing act that cities naturally do for some parts of the population, but not always. And then the rest more or less follows. But some of the things that are interesting is that people change behaviors, they change the way they are, they become more forward-looking in most cases when they live in these environments because they change very much. And therefore, they invest in education. They may invest a little bit in their own health and some things that are then associated with development. Okay, so all these things are actually not just stuff that people do. They're articulated because of the needs of the networks that cities create and the cost benefit also over time that they create. Okay, so a sketch that I always show, I'm sure you've seen this before, is that when you live in a city, you're interdependent with other people and organizations for everything, right? You don't produce your own food, you don't produce your own water. Everything you do depends on other people and services around you. So this, in some sense, is what people have come to describe as people-centered planning. And it's the idea that when you go around, sometimes people talk about the 15-minute city. That's just an instantiation of this, is that in order for people to more or less be creative and not just be surviving and doing basic things, they need to have a lot of these things. These are just one list. You can imagine your own list. Be available to them over space and time and on budget and with enough predictability such that you can have a life that's not just coping, but that can become enabled to be creative and productive and do all these other things that we want also for development at the personal level, but also at the city level. And this is the basics of urban science, is how these networks, which involve space, services and functions, individuals and households, all come together to produce actually a life that is well-serviced, but also creative. So in some sense, this is where planning comes down to, again, the idea of being more of a platform than a prescription. Okay, this gives you network effects. I didn't show you this, but it means that spaces tend to be more compact. You see this in Singapore, even over time. But also this can generate greater productivity that's economic if these complementarities are realized and conflict doesn't overtake those increases in density. By and large, Asian cities in Singapore do quite well at this, but they sometimes sacrifice a little bit of the spontaneity and creativity. And I think there's a little bit of possibility there for Singapore. So the idea is to turn the problem around. What we've learned from urban science is that the fundamental things are networks of people, heterogeneous cost benefit, by which I mean that in a large city like Singapore, but any large city, you have many different people. Some are poor, some are rich, some are young, some are old, some have different kinds of knowledge, different personal histories. And this means that they will adapt to the city and the people around them in different ways. You need to have cheap places for young people and maybe for newcomers to be and build their lives. You can also probably want to have expensive places, as you do in Singapore, in order for rich people to want to come and for you to properly tax them and so on, and throw it back into the pile, and so that the system stays dynamical. And then the third part, really, but this idea of heterogeneous cost benefit is difficult, because often in planning and economic theory, we tend to actually treat most agents as the same, and this is really not true. So heterogeneity can be good or can be bad. It can mean inequality, but it can also mean diversity. So it's something very dynamical that you can pay attention to and make sure that it's a process that's positive, that's realizing complementarities, for example, by not creating, for example, poverty traps, okay? And then the last part is really what this is all about, which is information, that people adapt to each other, they create enterprises that are collective, systems that actually embed information that no one actually understands as single individuals how it works, but this can create a company that creates an advanced service or product, a better kind of infrastructure, an innovation about water, whatever that is, that really comes from these interactions and the desire to make things better, and encodes information in these groups, not just individually, but really as collectives. So in some sense, these are the generative processes by which you can then ask, how should I organize space to realize these things? How should I organize time and costs? How should I subsidize housing or transportation such that these things stay open-ended for different kinds of people in different situations, right? So it's a little bit different. It may end up having prescriptions about zoning, but the logic of it is potentially different. So I want to give you a few examples from my own research. This is stuff that people do with papers and so on, but just to give you some examples about how this plays out. So this is a recent paper we wrote about human development, and there's this sort of an interesting idea that goes back now 30 years or so about how to measure human development beyond national accounts, so beyond GDP. And so this basically is a simple index that the UN Development Program measures every year for countries, and that many people, including us, been trying to bring to smaller scales of regions and then scales of neighborhoods in the case of this paper. So you see here on the bottom basically how to go from countries to states, this is the United States, obviously, to counties, which are sort of our units, administrative units, to all the way to census tracts on the right, that's Chicago. And you see that when you go to census tracts, the color is being preserved. You have a lot more diversity, a lot more inequality. So you have places in Chicago where people live. So this includes life expectancy, education, and real purchasing power. We have places in Chicago where people live to be 95. I'm sure also places in Singapore or longer. But there are also places where people live to be maybe 65. Okay, so it's tremendous inequality of things that should not be unequal. And what you find here is that by going to the scale, you start understanding how this advantage is kind of coupled. So this is just an idea. It goes with a picture I showed you before, that when people have certain disadvantages, like say housing or not enough or childcare or persistent poverty because they're in a situation where they cannot recover, then everything around them tends to become more difficult because they cannot get a job, they cannot keep a job, they cannot afford transportation, whatever it is. This, as you know, is worse in the United States than places with proper social provisions. But it just becomes this effect that I like to call the Hannah Karenina principle, that when one thing goes wrong, a lot of things often go wrong. And when you look at people that live well, they're in good situations, they often have that all these things are provided. So everything's going right. So, and that's often what we wish for a city, but because people are different, it's not always easy to do, but it requires attention to this level of detail. I was going to show you an example of something I saw in my last visit of Singapore, which is a relocation of some older citizens to new housing. This is because some of their old towns are being demolished because it was central and the space was very valuable. And what we found is that obviously, you placed older people in situations where they were more dependent. They didn't have all these things in their new housing. The new housing was nicer, but they didn't have all these services and all this support around them. And so what happened is that then you needed to provide that with social assistance, and no one was happy. The older people were not happy. The social service person felt frustrated. And sort of this function of integrating functions over space and time, particularly for populations that are more disadvantaged for one reason or another, is actually quite hard to do. And cities can do it quite naturally, but once you start doing this more artificial, you have to pay attention to the whole network. So this is something that we know, and that's the nature, if you will, of the complex system of cities. This is another paper I wrote recently that has to do with the implications of this for depression. And the fact it is known by psychologists that people that are more isolated, that have fewer social relations, tend to be more depressed. But so it follows that if in larger cities people have more social relations, even if they're informal or impersonal, that they would be less depressed. And this is exactly as expected. That's what we find for US data. And so we're bringing this down also to the scale of neighborhood in New York, where we know that this general result does not apply in our communities that are more isolated. But this starts showing you that there's sort of mechanisms at different scales, and that in some ways mechanisms of cities can be important, not just the individual. And this is a new paper, but it's really in places with very little infrastructure, particularly in Africa. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just to give you a sense that a lot of measures of disadvantage that you can spend a little bit of time reading the plot, that a lot of it has to do with education, with wealth, with access to services. They're all connected on small scales. It's again this Hannah Karenina principle that people that don't have services or don't have decent housing, they often have all kinds of other problems. The fact that they have those things does not necessarily mean they don't have the other problems, but it's necessary in order for the other problems to start being addressed. So it's this kind of holistic view around individuals and households and communities that needs to be created. And this is like a project that's really in the beginning. It's a little bit a poorer version of your Cooling Singapore project. It's really working with communities around issues of climate change, in this case heat, and understanding heat exposure in communities that also tend to be poorer historically. And there was an episode that's infamous in Chicago in '95 when a lot of people died. And it's now understood that some of the mitigating effects, like having air conditioning that's universal, which we don't have in Chicago, were not available to poorer populations. Better now. And so populations are now more protected, but that the effect really is an exposure effect. It takes about 2 days to be manifested. So there's a long time of exposure along which you can mitigate the effect, and then over longer terms, you can actually remove the risk to some extent. Okay, so I just want to finish with a few ideas about what science has to offer vis-a-vis just having a practical approach to this. So of course, you can offer some of these tools, networks, attention to needs around people, budgets in time, and money, and so on, and using these to rethink space. But what I want to emphasize is that there's a tension often when I talk to audiences in Singapore that what you want to do is solve the problems of Singapore. This happens in every city, it's understandable. But that's not what science gives you. Science gives you what I'm saying is generalizable knowledge. This is what the people in medicine like to talk about in terms of medicine being a medical science, right? So we will hear, of course, that every person is different, that every community is different. So how dare you say that there can be a science of this? Well, we do that in medicine. Every person is different, they have different personal histories, different exposures. But there are some aspects of physiology and so on that is generalizable. So there's a certain analogy there. It's not perfect, but that tells you what kind of generalization you can do also in the context of cities. So urban science is generalizable knowledge about the processes, as I said before, that create, sustain, and grow cities, but also can be brought down to these small scales in order for us to understand what makes an environment that's good for a household in certain situations, or even an individual or a company, and try to understand what kind of things they need from the city, and to what extent at some point, perhaps, they can be more independent because they have enough resources and access to them to then require less from the city, but can contribute more. So what conditions actually allow us to do that? And so in some sense, what we've had in the past for cities are rules of thumb at best, just ways of interpolate phenomena. And these are not science. They're kind of rituals for how we can do some things that affect the city. And some of them are good, like better transportation systems, better housing. You've done a lot of this in Singapore. But the special sauce of science is that it generalizes, as I said. It provides an extrapolation to new situations that we've never encountered before. In some sense, zoning, in order to solve social problems, is a bit like wanting to go to the moon without knowing the laws of gravity. It's not going to work very well. So what we need to do is to understand the process of cities in order to address some of the issues like climate change vulnerabilities as they get communicated through people and organizations, the effects of new technologies, but then things that are more personal, like aging and shrinking cities, and things that have to do with sustainable development as it affects people, but also as it affects the environment. So these are new things that we've never dealt with before. We all want to solve these issues or address them, but we've not been able to before. So back to this slide. This is back to you in some sense, which is how do you actually address the things on the left, or whatever problems you want or objectives you want to put on the left, and what should be the tools and the ideas and the frameworks that you actually use to connect what your tools are in policy to these objectives, and what are the articulating elements and the checkpoints where you can measure certain things, where you know you're in the right direction, at least by hypothesis, and where you verify that. And once you're doing that, which need not be done just by universities, but could be done by agencies and by people in civic society, then you're doing science, and then you're doing urban science. So thank you.